It is now my privilege and pleasure to introduce an esteemed colleague, Dr. Sherry Blowett, a respected physician at the Harvard Medical School. She has long held intense interest in sports medicine, the health and welfare of all athletes, and especially athletes with disabilities. Her interest in sports medicine is directly related to her extensive experience and success as a wheelchair athlete. During her competitive sports career, she was a frequent medalist at the Paralympic Games and a two-time winner in the women's wheelchair division of the Boston Marathon. As a clinician with a special focus on sports medicine and the health of athletes with disabilities, she's presently engaged in clinical practice, research, and international leadership. She joined the medical committee of the International Paralympic Committee, the IPC, in 2010 as athlete representative, and in 2014 became chair of that committee. To present President's lecture on the topic, Going for the Gold, Medical and Scientific Conundrums in Paralympic Sport, Dr. Sherry Blowett.
So I was saying, it's an honor, truly an honor and a privilege to be here with you this morning presenting a President's Lecture, and also I must say an honor to be introduced by the legendary Skip Nukin, who's been a mentor and a friend now in my early career. Our topic for the morning is Going for the Gold, Medical and Scientific Conundrums in Paralympic Sports Medicine. We have a 45-minute session. I hope this is exciting. I hope it's fun. I hope we have some good discussion after. And I hope to engage all of us as members of ACSM in further engagement with the Paralympic movement and working with athletes with disabilities. As an outline for today, I'll first provide a brief overview of the rapid growth of the Paralympic movement. This is really something that has come onto the scene in the last couple of decades in sports medicine more broadly. Because of our rapid growth, we've really been in a continuous phase of trying to keep up with ourselves with regards to all of the developments that are going on with regards to sports medicine and science. We'll talk about the importance of keeping Paralympic sport safe and legitimate and what's at stake. This impacts athletes, coaches, researchers, sports scientists across the board. And the decisions that we make in terms of maintaining the safety of Paralympic sport really impact the future of the movement in many ways. We'll use 3 case studies that represent current conundrums in Paralympic sports medicine and science to provide an example of the intersection of disability and sports medicine and how it raises a lot of really interesting questions that we need to delve into as professionals. We'll talk about boosting in athletes with spinal cord injury, as well as the use of cheetah legs in amputee sprinters, and anti-doping considerations that are unique for Paralympians when compared to their counterparts in the Olympic movement. And finally, we'll finish with a discussion of the growing role of sports medicine clinicians and investigators in Paralympic sport more broadly, and how we, as members of ACSM, can continue to be engaged. So the Paralympic movement is something that has really risen and grown rapidly over the last several decades. Initially, this started back in the 1940s when a neurologist in the United Kingdom, Dr. Ludwig Guttmann, was the first to have been credited to introduce sports as a tool for rehabilitation, and this was in veterans with spinal cord injury after World War II. So Dr. Guttmann first initiated the Stoke Mandeville Games, in which 16 athletes participated in sports such as archery and lawn bowling. So it wasn't necessarily the most competitive when it first started off, but it was an important step towards recognizing the importance of sport. If we then fast forward a little over 70 years, not too far into the future, the most recent Summer Paralympic Games in London saw the participation of over 4,000 athletes from 164 countries, breaking 251 world records. Rio, coming up in only a few short weeks, is estimated to have about 4,300 athletes participating in 22 sports. 2 new sports have just been added, that is para-triathlon and para-kayak and canoe. So we expect to see very exciting performances coming up. Because of this rapid trajectory of growth, the Paralympic movement has really been one in which we're really always running, really trying to stay ahead of ourselves and keep up with the growth and the needs of our athletes. This is a pictorial representation of athlete participation. The first official Paralympic Games were said to occur in 1960 in Rome. This is the first organized multi-sport event in which athletes came from international settings to be a part of the Games. If we then fast forward to London 2012, here you see this incredible trajectory of growth in terms of athlete participation. Of course, it's very important to note that the athletes at the Games really represent the very, very tip of the iceberg, with so many more, hundreds of thousands of athletes training at the domestic and regional level to someday have the opportunity to compete for their country on a world stage. We've also had a dramatic increase in public awareness around the Paralympic movement. A lot of this is driven by TV coverage in the media. London had broadcast coverage to over 100 countries, and there were 1.9 million visitors to the IPC website over the course of the London Paralympic Games. The figure here, that's courtesy of the IPC, shows the several 1,000% growth of broadcasting hours between the years of Sydney and Beijing, as well as Salt Lake and Vancouver. That trajectory did continue through Sochi and London, and we expect to continue in Rio as well. Sochi 2014 brought a big turn of events for us here in the US. This was the first time in which we had TV coverage over 50 produced hours on NBC as well as NBC Sports Network. This was a picture from the very triumphant gold medal match in ice sled hockey between the US and Russia. The US did win. Sorry if there's any Russians in the audience. And we've seen more and more Paralympians being used in major marketing campaigns, which I must say is extremely important because it demonstrates the value of the market of Paralympic sport and the fact that major sponsors, major corporate entities are beginning to understand the excitement and the way in which this speaks to volumes of people, both people with and without disabilities in the community. So we've had wild success, to be sure, but we still have some ongoing disparities. One of them is depicted here. Many of our countries come to the Paralympic Games, bringing only 1 or 2 athletes. Those athletes have typically had very little access to sports medicine services in their home environment. Little education, for example, on things like injury prevention, how to simply take care of yourself as an athlete as you're proceeding to compete internationally. Also little education and awareness around the rules and regulations of the anti-doping program, which can create problems when our athletes aren't aware of how to protect themselves from an unintentional positive test, for example. So here you see that most of the countries at the Games have 1 or 2 athletes. Those with over 200 athletes are just a handful, and that would be the United States, Canada, Australia, the UK, for example. So the Paralympic movement is really here to stay, and I think a lot of it comes down to these amazing images, these dramatic representation of the Games. This is a picture of the opening ceremonies from London. This stadium was packed with 80,000 people. You couldn't get a ticket. It was at a premium. It was actually difficult to attend the Paralympic Games because there was such a demand. Audiences really wanted to see it and to be there for this excitement. The opening ceremonies were kicked off by Stephen Hawking, a renowned astrophysicist, and they were closed by a concert by Coldplay, Rihanna, Jay-Z. So this is not a small side event. This is a huge international movement, and I wanted to show you this image for those of you who haven't been there so that you can understand what it looks like to be in that stadium during opening ceremonies. Of course, the prominence of the movement is driven by our athlete performances and these amazing stories of athletes who have overcome so much adversity simply to get to the world stage, then to win medals and to bring home a gold or silver or bronze to their country. This story is of Alessandro Zanardi, who is an Italian hand cyclist. He was a Formula One race car driver involved in an accident in 2001. He experienced bilateral above-knee amputations, went on to begin to train, really came to like the sport of hand cycling, continued to train for the next decade, ultimately competing in London and winning the time trial, bringing home gold. And in his triumphant picture after his win, he effortlessly lifted his carbon fiber bike over his head as if it weighed nothing, really demonstrating the intersection of cutting-edge technology with athlete performance, I think in a very amazing way. We're also continually impressed by the performances of our athletes, and sometimes how this really changes our own stigmas and stereotypes about what it means to be athletic, what it means to compete in the Paralympic Games. So one of the sports represented on the Paralympic program is bocce, and this is a sport that was particularly developed to serve the population of athletes with more significant mobility impairments, such as this athlete depicted here, who has spastic cerebral palsy. So bocce, for those who are unaware, is a sport in which you throw a ball and you try to with a lot of precision, try to get it to come as close to a target as possible. And the precision and control of that throw is the whole name of the game in terms of having a good performance. Well, there was a very simple study by a colleague, Nick Diper from the University of Loughborough, and he simply followed the heart rate of one of these bocce players over the course of a 4-hour match. And he showed that this athlete, who we might not see on the street and consider to be incredibly athletic, actually sustained a heart rate between 120 and 180 for that entire 4-hour match. And I must say, I think there's very few sports that require that level of athleticism for that type of duration. Maybe cycling in the Tour de France, for example. But we're continually striving ourselves to think about how we empower athletes with different types of disabilities to show their stuff and to show their talents on the Paralympic stage. And with all this growth and success comes controversies, and athletes would not be athletes if they didn't push the envelope. We have had a number of interesting cases, particularly with regards to anti-doping, and I don't want to give away too much too early because I'll outline this case later in the talk, but suffice it to say, as the Paralympic movement grows in prominence, as there's more money involved, there are controversies that pop up that we need to tackle, and a lot of the answers to those controversies are really steeped in sports medicine and science. The International Paralympic Committee is the umbrella organization that operates the Paralympic Games. And this is a very young organization. It was only formed in 1989 and headquarters opened in 1999. It's based in Bonn, Germany. It has a staff of 78 full-time employees, and 6 of these individuals work within the medical and scientific department. I can tell you that these guys do a Herculean amount of work trying to move forward the medical and scientific agenda in the Paralympic movement. They're supported by several external committees. I work with the medical committee, and we also have colleagues on topic areas of sports science, anti-doping, and classification. We're tasked with a number of things to include promoting athlete health and safety, original research investigations, such as tracking injury and illness epidemiology at the Games, anti-doping operations, as well as athlete coach and team physician education, of course, ensuring that everything that we learn in investigations, everything that we know regarding cutting-edge sports medicine topics, ultimately makes it to our athletes and coaches. So part of the movement is regulated by formal code. Some of this is borrowed from similar themes within the Olympic movement. For example, our medical code is a document that outlines the basic rights of athletes, things like informed consent and protection of their health information, for example. Some of the code is developed de novo to meet the needs of the Paralympic Committee. For example, the IPC Athlete Classification Code outlines the rules and regulations by which we run our system of classification. For those who aren't aware, this is a mechanism by which we place athletes in similar categories with athletes that have a similar level of disability, so that then when they go onto the field of play, they're competing in a fair match in which the most talented and well-trained athlete can win, not merely the athlete who has the lesser or lesser disability or less impairment. So some of these formal documents really are sort of the guiding forces through the movement. On a day-to-day basis, it's a little more complex. So Peter van de Vliet is our medical and scientific director, and he spends a great amount of his day on either the phone, Skype, or email, communicating with a number of stakeholders throughout the movement, trying to move these various agendas forward. So we're in constant touch with folks like us on the medical committee. You might recognize this gentleman, Dr. Walt Thompson, our incoming president of ACSM, who works on the IPC Sports Science Committee. Dr. Ann Hart works with our classification agenda, and Tony Pascual chairs our anti-doping committee. Tony's Spanish and runs the Spanish Anti-Doping Laboratory. So it's a constant conversation between the committees, to try to best answer the questions, these somewhat thorny questions that affect our athletes. We all, of course, talk to one another. If we have a question that's specific to classification, of course, we're going to be on the phone with Anne. Or maybe it has something to do with the research behind a particular classification question, in which we would be on the phone with Walt. So it's very much a team approach. Our team is also sometimes guided by the advice and consultation with external experts, such as Richard Budgett from the IOC Medical and Scientific Department. There's a lot of great collaboration between the Olympic and Paralympic movement. Dr. Andrei Krasyukov is a researcher from the University of Vancouver, who's really a world's expert in topics such as spinal cord injury and autonomic regulation. So we reach out to external experts who simply know more than we do on a particular topic area, and Andrei is one example of one of these individuals. And ultimately, a lot of our decisions are guided by consultation with the IPC CEO, Javier Gonzalez. it's important to know that every decision we make does have financial implications. There's a budget, and so there's often conversations around what would we ideally like to do and what can we do in the here and now? What are our short and long-term goals in terms of feasibility? At the end of the day, all of our actions are managed by Ann Sargent, who I hope is in the audience and is probably blushing right now, our IPC medical manager, who's very much the herder of cats, so to speak, and keeps all of us on our agenda and keeps things moving forward. We'll now launch into our controversies, first discussing the topic of boosting in athletes with spinal cord injury, moving forward to cheetah legs and a discussion of how we determine leg length in amputee sprinters, and then anti-doping considerations for Paralympians. So the problem of boosting. Boosting is the intentional induction of autonomic dysreflexia for performance-enhancing purposes. And this is a practice that is possible for athletes with spinal cord injury at or above the level of T6. Let me explain a little bit what that means. So autonomic dysreflexia is a pathologic response in which an individual with spinal cord injury has a noxious or painful stimuli below their level of injury. The most common provoking factor is something like a distended bladder or a tight strap around the legs, for example. That noxious stimuli might not be sensed as painful to the athlete because they may have reduced sensation because of their spinal cord injury. Given that, the noxious stimuli sends an afferent response up to the spinal cord and into the sympathetic chain that's then fed back into back to the adrenal glands, which begin to pump out stress hormone, epinephrine and norepinephrine, kind of eliciting that reflex fight or flight response. Now, in most of us, when we have our fight or flight response, it's controlled by our brain, and our brain communicates to our adrenal glands and our systemic circulation, and it says, well, we know you're stressed, you have a stressful situation here, we know that you need to be alert, and the stress response is useful. However, let's slow it down so that you don't have a catastrophic health event. Well, in these athletes, because of the spinal cord injury, the brain is not communicating to the adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands continue to reflexively pump out epinephrine and norepinephrine. And ultimately, this can result in catastrophic health consequences, such as hypertensive emergency and downstream effects like hemorrhagic stroke or myocardial infarction. So it's a very dangerous response. Over the last several decades, unfortunately, there became a practice in which athletes with higher level spinal cord injury were able to use this autonomic dysreflexia physiology to gain a performance benefit in competition. Many of these athletes have what we call cardiovascular blunting, meaning that their maximum heart rate is actually in the 120s or 130s, even at max exercise because of the limitations of the cardiovascular system given their spinal cord injury. So using autonomic dysreflexia was a way to overcome their own cardiovascular blunting and have a better performance on the field of play. So autonomic dysreflexia and boosting can result in catastrophic health consequences that we're aware of. And unfortunately, it can infer a performance benefit up to 10%, and I'll share that study with you in a moment. And for all these reasons, it's strictly banned, highly discouraged within Paralympic competition, even though we knew it was a practice or a problem in terms of practice on a day-to-day basis. So there's a few studies that inform us more about autonomic dysreflexia and boosting. This is a very simple one from 2001, in which they had 4 athletes, 4 rugby players, and 4 wheelchair racers. And they compared their physiologic response to exercise in a boosted versus non-boosting state. And on the figure on the right, what you'll see is that on the x-axis, you have E representing epinephrine and NE representing norepinephrine. 0 represents rest, and max represents max exercise. So here you see a difference in the level of circulating catecholamines, particularly at max exercise, for athletes who are in a boosted state. And you'll see that an athlete who's boosted circulates a great deal more, particularly norepinephrine, when compared to an athlete who's not boosted. Additionally, they went on to then show that the athlete did have higher peak power, higher maximum blood pressure and heart rate, and higher VO2 max. So a simple study that was kind of a classic one from back in the 90s put several athletes in a controlled racing environment on a stationary trainer such as this, and they had them do a 7.5K time trial in a boosted state versus a non-boosted state. Very simple design, and they simply showed that these athletes performed about 10% better in their 7.5K race time while in a boosted state. So unfortunately, although we know that boosting occurs in practice, athlete awareness is quite low. So this was an anonymous survey that was carried out at the Beijing Games. And what they showed was that 56% of athletes surveyed, these were all athletes with spinal cord injury, had knowledge of the practice of boosting. 16.7%, all males of note, had boosted to improve performance at some point in the past. We don't know that if that was 10 years ago or 10 days ago, but they had done it at some point. And only 25.5%, unfortunately, were aware that this was very dangerous to health. So here we see a complete disconnect between the concern around this prohibited method and athletes' awareness regarding the fact that it actually is not a good idea and extremely detrimental to their overall health. So for all these reasons, starting in 2008, we developed a testing program. So this was first rolled out under the guidance of Dr. Stuart Willick, who's in the audience, at the Beijing Paralympic Games. And initially, we used simple blood pressure as a proxy for the presence of autonomic dysreflexia. This was carried forth through the Pan American Games and the London Games, and it will be also implemented in Rio. Athletes tested are those with spinal cord injury at or above the level of T6 in the sports of athletics and hand cycling. These are the sports that we knew historically had a problem with boosting, given athlete reports, clinical observations, etc. And these are the classes that athletes with higher level spinal cord injury compete. So our testing protocol involves athletes being selected at random off of the heat sheets. These are, of course, in the classes in which we have athletes with spinal cord injury. The athlete be notified that they've been selected for testing at some point within 1 hour and greater than 10 minutes before the start time of their event. An athlete can select a representative to accompany them to the testing program, a witness to that result. And the testing would be performed at a designated location near the first call room right before the athlete goes to check in for their race. So blood pressure is measured via an automated cuff. This is done because it has a digital reading, so the athlete, their witness, as well as the person doing the test can read it. We know it's sometimes a little bit less accurate than a manual cuff, so every day prior to testing, we check it and calibrate it with a manual cuff to make sure it's accurate. Goal systolic blood pressure is to be under 180. That's the threshold that was initially chosen as a marker of a positive boosting test or the presence of autonomic dysreflexia. If the systolic blood pressure is at or greater than 180, the athlete is retested in 10 minutes, and if it remains greater than 180, they're withdrawn from competition by the technical delegate of the event. The athlete is allowed to file paperwork in advance to have a discussion with the medical committee if they have essential hypertension or other reasons to be hypertensive that may be present just prior to competition so that we can avoid a false positive result or avoid calling a positive test on an athlete who may not be dysreflexic but is hypertensive for other reasons. So far since 2008, we've been able to test 159 athletes, 136 males and 23 females. This is largely the fact that more males compete in these events. And again, historically, given the targeted testing program, we know that boosting is typically more of a problem in male athletes. All athletes were compliant with testing, and our mean systolic pre-competition over all of these events has been 131 millimeters of mercury. One athlete did test greater than 180, however, their repeat test 10 minutes later was at 175. And no athletes have been withdrawn from competition to date, which is actually a problem, and we're looking to change the protocol for that reason. That said, we've had several suspicious cases. One example is here. This is a male athlete who competed in athletics T52 100-meter event. This is very suspicious for a missed positive test. You'll see here that we measured the athlete at the time of the 100-meter prelim as well as the 100-meter final. The prelim occurred in the morning and the final later on that same day. And here you see that the athlete was quite hypertensive just prior to their 100-meter prelim, whereas they were normotensive later in the afternoon at the time of their final, and the discrepancy between the values is very dramatic. Additionally, when the athlete was hypertensive, they also had a heart rate of 87 as compared to a heart rate of 102 when they were normotensive later in the day. This is actually classic for the physiologic response to autonomic dysreflexia. You can see a relative bradycardia at the same time as the athlete is hypertensive. That's because the hypertension is sensed by the carotid baroreceptors, which sends a signal through the vagus nerve to the heart to slow down heart rate. So the fact that the athlete was close to having a positive test with a heart rate only in the 80s was indicative of the fact that they probably were dysreflexic at the time of the 100-meter prelim. Additionally, the athlete did race a bit faster, about 5% better at the time of the prelim. So for all these reasons, of course, we have to ask ourselves the uses and limitations of this testing program. For and foremost, this has been developed to act as a deterrent mechanism for the practice of boosting and as an impetus for education to our athlete population. We have to ask questions like, well, we haven't had a positive test. Maybe there has been a decrease in the prevalence of boosting. This certainly could be the case, although the Bambani study that I showed you from 2008 did indicate that athletes are still likely boosting, at least some athletes. Another question is, can boosting occur after testing is complete? Well, it certainly could. It would be much harder to do so, however, because typically the mechanism of inducing dysreflexia is bladder distension. That obviously takes a little while to accumulate. And additionally, once the athlete goes into the first call room, then they're under a lot of scrutiny. There's officials in the area, other athletes, and it would be a lot harder to induce a painful stimulus in that type of setting. And the main question that we grappled with is whether the systolic blood pressure threshold of 180 was too high. And as years went on and we continued to look at the results of our testing program, we thought that yes, this is probably the case. So this is a representation of all of the blood pressure readings that we've taken since 2008. And the blood pressure readings are represented by the green line. And here you see there seems to be a nice sort of physiologic appearing curve between the systolic blood pressure range of about 90 to about 160. And then at 160, it seems to take sort of a steep curve up. And we began to look at this and amongst the committee questioned, it seems that there's something abnormal going on physiologically, that we have this small subset of athletes that have relatively increased blood pressures above that threshold of 160. This represented 6 athletes and 10 readings in the overall testing program. Additionally, if you looked at the mean blood pressure values of 131, that was the mean over all of our tests so far, and then if you calculate basic standard deviations, 2 standard deviations above that mean is 168 millimeters of mercury systolic. So it seemed to be that there was sort of a place in the 160s in which an athlete was probably dysreflexic, probably boosting if this was happening just prior to competition, yet we weren't catching it because of our threshold at 180. For that reason, with discussion in the committee and with discussion of the board of the IPC, we have lowered the threshold to 160, and this will be implemented immediately in the first event for which it will take effect is the European Championships this summer, as well as the Rio Paralympics. We're also considering moving the testing location up a bit, and that will, of course, deal with some of these mitigating factors regarding why we potentially have not had a positive test, even though we think that boosting still occurs. 160 is a bit lower, we recognize that, but we also want to continue to educate athletes regarding the fact that competing at a systolic blood pressure of 160 probably is also not safe. So if you know that you're someone who's susceptible to autonomic dysreflexia, you need to work with your team physician and your team staff to monitor your blood pressures in training and understand whether or not you're reaching that level and whether or not you would be at risk for a positive test in a games time environment. The main goal of this whole program is truly to be deterrent. We don't want to unfairly take athletes out of competition, but we want to make sure that competition stays fair and that there isn't a subset of athletes who are using this prohibited method in order to gain an unfair advantage. We also want to ensure that athletes are safe and not on the field of play in a hypertensive state that would be incredibly dangerous to both their performance as well as their overall health. Our second case is moving on to a discussion of the use of cheetah legs in amputees. This is a very complex issue, and we're going to go look at the cases of a few different athletes. We're going to start by investigation or discussion of the case of Oscar Pistorius, who is the athlete who was really one of the first to push the envelope and challenge the international community to question whether or not the use of bilateral lower extremity prosthesis is an appropriate use of technology versus something that creates an unfair performance enhancement. So Oscar initially came onto the scene in 2004 at the Athens Paralympics, where he won the 200. He was a young athlete, clearly with a ton of promise, and people were very excited to see where this went and how he developed. In 2007, he continued to train, continued to post faster times, and it became apparent that he was actually in striking distance of potentially qualifying for both the Olympic and Paralympic Games in Beijing. Well, people started to get nervous. There started to be this intense conversation internationally regarding whether or not this was fair. At around that same time, the International Athletics Federation, or the IAAF, amended their competition rules to ban, in quotes, any technical device that incorporates springs, wheels, or any other element that provides a user with an advantage over another athlete not using such a device. So, an interesting rule to develop at the same time as Oscar was trying to compete and vie to be involved in both the Olympic and Paralympic Games. This was said to not apply directly to him, however, it was fairly uncanny regarding the timing of this new rule. So because of this, Oscar was told, of course, that he couldn't compete in initially the IAAF World Championships. And of course, this was very unsettling. He wasn't happy with that answer. So he underwent testing at the German Sport University of Cologne. This testing was actually requested by the IAAF. They wanted to learn more regarding the mechanics of his prosthetic devices. At that time of testing, it was determined that he had what was called a 35% mechanical advantage in the final sprint of a 200-meter event. Now, this was measured over the last 50 meters just prior to the finish line. For many reasons, however, the results of this study were questioned. Oscar actually also came over here to Boston and had testing at MIT, which showed different results. Additionally, it was noted that in Germany, in that testing, they didn't look at his start. And it's thought that when you look at the performance of an amputee sprinter, there's a relative disadvantage at the start because of the give of the prosthetic devices that then you accumulate and you make up for near the finish of the race. So not taking the start into account was a big miss during the time of this initial testing in Germany. But for all these reasons, he was deemed ineligible to compete in able-bodied sport at the time. So of course, this was not a popular decision with Oscar and his team in South Africa. So they appealed this decision to the Court of Arbitration of Sport, or CAS. CAS is essentially the Supreme Court of Sports. It's several arbitrators who hear cases. It's based in Lausanne, Switzerland. And essentially, the ultimate decision of CAS is what stands. It's the highest level of a decision-making body that you can get to in terms of sports medicine and science. So CAS looked at this case, they heard testimony from several individuals, and ultimately they decided that the evidence was insufficient to prohibit Oscar from competing. They looked at different methodological flaws in the German testing and the way that it disagreed and was not able to be replicable with the testing at MIT. So ultimately CAS ruled that where there is no sufficient evidence of any metabolic advantage in favor of the disabled athlete could not be banned to compete in international IAAF sanctioned events alongside able-bodied athletes. So moving forward, in the summer of 2008, Oscar did not qualify for the South African Paralympic team, although he was very close. He did compete in the Beijing Paralympics and had a spectacular performance, bringing home gold in the 100, 200, and 400. Fast forward then 4 years, so Oscar, of course, continued to train, continued to come into even more international notoriety. Leading up to London, it again became clear that he was in striking distance to qualify for both the South African Olympic and Paralympic team, and he did. He qualified. So Oscar competed in the IAAF World Championships and then went on to compete in the London Olympics. He qualified in the 400 as well as participating in the South African 4x400 team. He advanced to the second heat in the 400 and then placed 8th, so he did not advance to the semifinals, but still very impressive performance. And the 4x400 team came in 8th. About 10, 14 days later, at the time of the 2012 London Paralympics, the first event that Oscar raced was the 200. Now, given his performance at the Olympics, given his gold in the 200 in Beijing, everyone assumed he was kind of a shoo-in to win. So the gun went off. Oscar had a great start that came around the corner. He was still in the lead at the start of the straightaway. In the last 50 meters of the race, he was actually overtaken by a young Brazilian that no one had previously been paying much attention to. His name was Alan Oliveira, and Alan actually beat Oscar right at the finish line in a photo finish. This was a very unexpected result, and it actually raised a lot of controversy because immediately after the event, Oscar claimed and went to the media with the concern that the Brazilian athlete was using artificially lengthened bilateral lower extremity prosthesis, thus giving him a performance advantage. And here's a picture of Oscar and Alan Oliveira directly after one of their events, and you can see that Alan's prosthetic devices, they simply appear longer. Now, he has a shorter residual limb, so that accounts for some of it, but overall it did kind of raise some eyebrows regarding how we account for maximum standing height in these athletes. Oscar did go on then to win the 400, so he did bring home a gold. So the question was raised, how do we determine maximum leg length in Paralympic sprinters? And at the time, this was determined by a 3-step process. The first was that the measurement would be taken from the olecranon to the ulnar styloid. This was placed in a calculation based on historic anthropometric measurements in order to estimate standing height. We would then measure the demispan, which is the length from the midsternal notch to the third metacarpal phalangeal joint. This was also placed in an equation accounting for anthropometric measurements. These two values, after they had been put into the formulas, were averaged, and 2.5% was added to determine what was called the maximum allowable standing height, or MASH. And then every athlete would be checked to ensure that they weren't above their maximum allowable standing height in the first call room just before they compete. So when you look at this MASH calculation and you compare Alan and Oscar, what you see actually is that Oscar was not running at his maximum allowable standing height. There was about a 2-inch discrepancy between the height he was allowed to run at and the height that he actually utilized in competition, versus Alan Oliveira actually almost maximized his maximum allowing standable height. And the question is, well, why? Why didn't Oscar use longer prosthesis himself? That would still be within the rules and may give himself a better performance. And ultimately, and with great interest, this came down to the fact that at the time of the 2007 Cass case, he was approved to utilize a certain parameter of prosthetic device in able-bodied competition at the IAAF World Championships and the Olympics. And he was held to these regulations to compete in the London Olympic Games. So Oscar would have essentially had to switch prosthesis between the Olympics and the Paralympics, which is only about a 10-day period of time. And if you think about the mechanics of running on bilateral prosthesis, there's no way that you could make that change within that short period. You know, you train your starts, your cadence, your stride length, all of the above. So Oscar was really caught in this catch-22 of wanting to compete in the Olympic Games, being okayed to do this by CAS, but then having to use the devices that were permitted based on this legal decision. So a really interesting intersection between legal proceedings and sport performance. So the plot then thickened if we fast forward from the time frame of 2012 to 2016. And post-London, there was certainly a call to look at this 3-step process, and people were wondering, well, there must be something better. So in addition, the 3-step process that was in place was very limiting with regards to athletes who also had upper extremity amputation, which accounts for several athletes within the Paralympic movement. So an expert group was formed from individuals from Germany, Japan, and Australia at the University of Queensland. And they took a look at all the prior literature, older papers that look at how you determine maximum height or height estimates from other anthropometric measurements. And ultimately, it was determined to use the work of Dr. Alicia Canda from Spain. And she put out this great paper from 2009 that estimated standing height based on a number of different anthropometric measurements that could be utilized in athletes who had different body types. So for example, this is a sample from one of the figures that looks at the correlation between hand length, thigh length, lower leg length, and foot length, and how that is fairly linear with standing height. They then did multiple regression analysis and came up with several equations that can be used to estimate standing height. And the new gold standard moving forward is going to be based on this beginning on January 1st. To provide an example, an athlete who is a below-knee amputee, for that athlete, we would be using calculation M8, which takes into account sitting height, thigh length, upper arm length, and forearm, whereas an athlete who is an above-knee amputee, we would be taking into account sitting height, upper arm length, and forearm length, clearly not using thigh length because they're an above-knee amputee. So chose the equation that had the highest R squared and also fit the parameters for which that athlete could be measured. And this will be carried forward and is much more reproducible and a reliable way to estimate what should be an athlete's maximum standing height. There are additional complexities on the horizon. Some of you may have heard of the unilateral below-knee amputee Marcus Rehm from Germany, who is preparing for Rio. Marcus is an extraordinary athlete, a long jumper, and he recently posted a world record at the European Championships with a jump at 8.4 meters, which of note would have won the gold medal in the London Olympics. So Marcus is now at the stage. He's clearly taking the world by storm within the Paralympic movement. And he is also vying to potentially compete at the Rio Olympics. He's receiving a lot of pushback. It's yet again another controversy that's now at the fore. Part of the issue of concern is that Marcus jumps off his launch leg is his prosthetic side. And so this concern, of course, that the spring within his prosthetic device is giving him an advantage at the time of his jump. So more to come on that. The jury is still out. It's still undergoing investigations. For now, the IAAF is saying no, but there's a lot more to come into the future. And I must say that these additional complexities, in many ways, we should see them as opportunities. Ultimately, we'll come to the most fair conclusion, but it brings up great international conversation and really pushes us to look at the science and to look at how we best regulate this area of Paralympic sport. Our last case for the morning will be an exploration of topics that are unique to Paralympic athletes with regards to anti-doping. And there are several issues that are very unique to disability sport that do represent ongoing conundrums. Some of them are the issue of sample collection, issues of increased use of several medications that are on the prohibited list when compared to Olympic athletes, and an ongoing conundrum of therapeutic use exemptions, or TUEs, and thinking about them from the framework of fairness versus inclusion, and which should be the principle that we uphold the most. It's important to note that the Paralympic movement falls under the same rules and regulations of the World Anti-Doping Code, and Paralympic athletes take part in the same program of both in and out of competition testing as their peers within the Olympic movement. So it's a quite rigorous program. So sample collection within anti-doping is a highly regulated process. Urine samples are still used most frequently, although we now also utilize blood samples, saliva samples, and several other ways of monitoring for drug use in sport. For those who have never undergone a test collection procedure, let me outline how it goes. So essentially, an athlete is notified that they've been selected for testing, and again, this can occur in competition or out of competition. They're then escorted to a doping control station, particularly if in competition, and this escort stays with you. They're like your Siamese twin for several hours until you're ready to give a sample. You're watched that whole time. They're then escorted into the restroom by the doping control officer, and you're observed giving a sample. So yes, they actually watch you go, which is extremely awkward for athletes, but part and parcel of what you sign up to when you're competing to participate in high level of sport. And then these samples are, of course, sealed and sent to the lab for analysis. Well, for many years, this process was taking place without a lot of event or a lot of problem. However, at some point it occurred to us, well, how do we take into account considerations for athletes who urinate or void with use of a catheter, or athletes who self-catheterize? And we hadn't really asked this question. It actually had not come up in the busyness of day-to-day work until our hand was forced by a case. And this is the case of athlete A, who is an elite wheelchair racer. And athlete A actually had a positive test for cocaine at the Wheelchair Marathon World Championships. Now, cocaine, it's important to know that this is prohibited in competition. Clearly, it's a very strong stimulant, but it's actually not prohibited out of competition. So the athlete, at the time of this positive test, stated that an unknown woman had put cocaine in his mouth at a nightclub 7 days prior in Toronto. I don't know what's going on in Toronto. Causing contamination of his catheter. So he used a catheter to urinate that evening. There was clearly a presence of cocaine in his urine at the same time on that day when he received had this event. He then competed about 7 days later, and he used that same catheter in the doping control station, and he stated that the cocaine that was present in his urine was actually from his tainted catheter that he had used at the nightclub 7 days prior. So he had this positive rule violation. He was given a 2-year suspension, and his athlete and his lawyer appealed, stating that the national anti-doping authorities did not provide reasonable accommodation by providing sterile catheters within the doping control station. Interesting. So ultimately, this was brought to our favorite place, the Court of Arbitration of Sport, and CAS actually found in favor of the athlete because the athlete had committed an anti-doping rule violation. He had a positive test. But interestingly, the events at the nightclub were thought to be true. There must have been witnesses or other corroborating evidence. I'm not as familiar with that part of the case. And additionally, that the athlete could not have reasonably appreciated the risks of using a used catheter. So this is when you really get into the legal aspects of the case and burden of proof and evidence. And even if it seems somewhat outside of logic, you have to go with what the proof shows. They also ruled that his national anti-doping authority did not violate disability rights law and reasonably accommodated the athlete. So all of this and this surprise case that kind of fell in our laps led to a reactive yet very important policy regarding a position statement on the use of catheters in doping control, stating that within this perspective and giving absolute priority to athlete health, the catheter used is the responsibility of the athlete, and although not mandatory, it is recommended that athletes use sterile catheters. So essentially saying that the catheter is the personal equipment of the athlete. We can't expect that the doping control station or any anti-doping authority would be able to have all of the types and sizes of catheters that an athlete would need to use. So ultimately, it's the responsibility of the athlete to ensure that they have the right equipment on hand. All right. So So athletes can apply for a therapeutic use exemption if it's determined that the medication is medically necessary with no reasonable alternative and that it doesn't provide a performance benefit beyond returning to a state of normal health. So this has really brought up a conversation, an ongoing conversation regarding the principle of fairness versus the principle of inclusion. And if there's a medication that the athlete needs, such as a beta blocker, is it more important that the athlete have that medication so that they can remain healthy and compete within the Paralympic movement, or should we ultimately consider fairness in the fact that that medication might actually give them a performance benefit to be the ultimate principle that is important to uphold? All of this has really played out around the case of beta blockers. So I'm going to show you a few cases that have recently come up and how it presents this extreme gray area that we're still working through. So athlete B, as we'll call him, is a shooting athlete with a history of myocardial infarction. The athlete had heart disease, and for this reason, he was granted a therapeutic use exemption from metoprolol by his national anti-doping agency. So this was in 2010, and at the time, in discussion with the International Shooting Federation, the predominant thought was that beta blocker is so performance enhancing in the sport of shooting that even if you need it, you simply can't be allowed to take it in competition. Beta blocker is thought to reduce skeletal muscle tremor, which is clearly important in shooting, and it also slows your heart rate. And in Olympic and Paralympic shooting, the athletes try to shoot between heartbeats in order to get the maximum precision. So if your heart rate is slower, it clearly offers a performance benefit. So the athlete appealed this rejection to CAS, and the IPC decision at that time was withheld, and part of the statement from CAS noted that beta blocker is performance enhancing beyond the level which might be anticipated by a return to a normal state of health. So essentially saying, yes, we recognize that the athlete needs the medication, but it would be so unfair to every other athlete in the event that unfortunately they simply cannot use it in a competition environment. So in this case, CAS found the principle of fairness to be the one that was the most important to uphold, fairness to all the other athletes that would be competing in that event. If you then go forward 2 years, we had another athlete, athlete C, who was also in the sport of shooting, and this athlete had muscular dystrophy with dilated cardiomyopathy and an ejection fraction of 30%, so clearly very altered cardiovascular control. He applied for a therapeutic use exemption for carvedilol and was granted the TUE by his national anti-doping agency. He brought it to the IPC. It had to be approved by the IPC because he was going to compete internationally. And interestingly, this fell into our laps. It was actually a very difficult decision because the case just 2 years prior had set case precedent that we should not be approving beta blockers for use in international competition. So for this reason, the TUE was rejected. The athlete appealed. At this time, the appeal body was WADA, so they appealed to WADA, and the IPC decision was reversed. And WADA at the time said use of medication would not produce any additional enhancement of performance other than which might be anticipated by a return to the state of normal health. So here they were saying that because the etiology of cardiac dysfunction was different and because this athlete had muscular dystrophy with the dilated cardiomyopathy, that it would be, rather than being performance enhancing, it would simply be a return to his normal state of health. Now, there's not a lot of evidence to back that up, but that was determined to be the case at the time. If we then fast forward to this year, 2016, that athlete had the TUE for carvedilol, and it expired, so he had to reapply. And we were in the same gray area. So the athlete, again, was granted the TUE for carvedilol by his national anti-doping agency. And again, we rejected it at the IPC because we felt like, again, it was extremely unfair that we had told one athlete via a CAS case that they could not use it, and then to grant another athlete the ability to use it. This time, the athlete appealed to WADA, and interestingly, in a 180-degree turn of events, the IPC decision was upheld, and the TUE was not approved. The athlete then appealed to CAS, and the CAS just recently, in the last few weeks, ruled in favor of the athlete, and we have yet to have that full reasoned decision. So what we're hoping is that further results from this particular CAS case might give more clarity regarding varied etiologies of cardiac dysfunction and whether or not we should emphasize fairness versus inclusion when we look at these TUEs, because at the present time, this most recent case clearly optimized the principle of inclusion. So the ultimate question is whether we should treat different cases differently. So are some of these etiologies of cardiac dysfunction inherent to disability, whereas others aren't? Well, I think that's a very gray area. Clearly, dilated cardiomyopathy due to muscular dystrophy is secondary to the athlete's disability, but one could argue that myocardial infarction due to reduced lower extremity strength and not ambulating for many years is also ultimately due to the athlete's disability. So I think it would be hard to say which cases are and which are not directly disability linked. And the question remains, where do we draw the line? And unfortunately, there's ongoing confusion that really makes it unfair to athletes, because athletes who may need a beta blocker simply don't know what's going to happen with their TUEs when they put in that application prior to major international competition. Other medications that are important for Paralympic use include antispasticity agents such as baclofen, tizanidine, and diazepam, anti-neuropathic agents, and medications used for spastic bladder. These are all not prohibited, and so very fair and easy for athletes to use in competition. So our take-home points include that the Paralympic movement continues to grow at a truly unprecedented rate, and we have a lot of controversies that still remain. And ultimately, athletes are athletes, and they're going to push the envelope and challenge us towards that next level of performance. And I would say that I think these debates are crucial and very healthy ones to be having. If we weren't talking about these things, it's not that the cases wouldn't be occurring, it's just that we wouldn't be knowing about it or wouldn't be addressing it proactively. And what's our ultimate goal? Well, our ultimate goal is to ensure that more athletes have the opportunity to play in competition that's fair and safe, and that we're able to bring in more international audiences to understand the impact and excitement of Paralympic sport. These are pictures of me on our farm in Iowa when I was about 2 years old in high school competition, not yet quite a superstar at that time with my cricket helmet, and winning gold in the 800 in Athens. So ultimately, it's all about giving more athletes the opportunity to have this trajectory towards success and competing if that's the way that they want to take their lives. So I have to say that us at ACSM are poised to lead these conversations, and ACSM members can be involved in many different ways as classifiers, medical staff, researchers, and looking into policy and governments. Rio is coming up, stay tuned, it should be very exciting and interesting. A quick shout out for the IOC Advanced Team Physician course. This is in Cape Town, South Africa in November. We will for the first time be having a Paralympic module, which is extremely exciting, thanks to the advocacy of my colleague, Dr. Wayne Derman. There are still openings for this course. If you're interested, get online and register. And the IOC World Conference on Injury and Illness Prevention in Sport is coming up next year as well. We'll also have some great content, particularly related to injury epidemiology in Paralympic sport. Our IPC Vista conference also coming up in 2017. This is particular to Paralympic sports medicine and science, and will take place in Toronto. So many thanks to everyone. Thank you for sticking with us today. In particular, thanks to Dr. Larry Armstrong for the invitation to give this lecture. Thank you.